What would you sacrifice for family? Love, trust, years of marriage, all of it can shatter in an instant when the truth comes to light. At the heart of this story is Anthony, faced with an impossible choice: protect the home that holds his parents' legacy, or bow to his wife's ultimatum. As dark secrets unravel, betrayals emerge that will change everyone's lives forever. Mysteries, manipulation, and a fight for justice. Are you ready to discover who will prevail in this psychological showdown? My dear friend, be sure to subscribe to my channel if this is your first time here, and give your royal like to this video. Anthony surveyed the stark, empty walls of the apartment he had hurriedly leased. The bare surroundings mirrored the weight of his spiraling thoughts. Sandra's ultimatum reverberated through his mind like the tolling of a relentless bell. The harsh sunlight streaming through the windows emphasized the mismatch of the sparse furniture: a sagging couch, a coffee table marred with countless rings, and a temperamental lamp that buzzed faintly. The space exuded impermanence. His phone vibrated on the coffee table, Sandra's name illuminating the screen for the 5th time that day. He let it ring, watching as the light faded, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Leaning back, he closed his eyes, only to be confronted by yesterday's scene, still vivid and inescapable. Sandra had stood in their shared kitchen, a kitchen that once belonged to his parents. Her manicured nails had tapped impatiently against the granite countertop they'd chosen together nearly a decade ago. "It's straightforward, Anthony," she had said, sliding a stack of papers toward him with calculated precision. Her tone was measured, deliberate, and rehearsed. "Abigail needs help. That's what families are supposed to do." He had picked up the papers, the formal letterhead glaring back at him with cold authority. "You're asking me to sign over my parents' house to your sister?" His disbelief was palpable. "Abigail's struggling," Sandra replied smoothly. "The housing market's a nightmare right now, and with Luke's business faltering—" She waved a hand dismissively, brushing aside any resistance. "It's just a house, Anthony." Her words struck him like a physical blow. "Just a house? My father worked 3 decades to pay off that mortgage. He gave it to us as a wedding gift." Sandra's expression hardened, the warmth in her voice replaced by an icy edge. "I need your decision by tomorrow. Either you sign the papers, or we're done." A honk from the street below snapped Anthony out of the memory. Unlocking his phone, he opened the photo gallery, scrolling aimlessly until he paused on one image: his father standing proudly in front of the house, his arm wrapped around Anthony's mother. It was the day they'd handed over the keys. His mother's eyes shimmered with tears, and his father had rested a firm hand on Anthony's shoulder. "Take care of it, son," his father had said. "This house has seen us through everything." Both of them were gone now. Cancer had claimed his mother 3 years earlier, and grief had followed swiftly to take his father just 6 months later. The house wasn't just property. It was a sanctuary of memories, love, and endurance. Anthony's finger hovered over Sandra's contact name. A decade of marriage, yet he had never seen her so calculating, so devoid of empathy. Flipping to their shared calendar, he scrolled through the past year. Sandra's frequent meetings with Abigail stood out, as did Luke's increasing absences from family gatherings, always excused by vague reasons. Something was off. The rushed demand, the pressing deadline, it all seemed orchestrated. Luke's financial troubles had never seemed this dire before. Why now? Glancing at his laptop, still logged into the joint email account they had created during their wedding, Anthony hesitated. Sandra occasionally used it for coordinating family events. Driven by a need for clarity, he began sifting through old messages. Most were mundane: recipes, reminders, and plans. But then a subject line caught his attention: Luke's late night. The timestamp was from 8 months ago. His stomach clenched as he debated opening it. Was he crossing a line? But Sandra's ultimatum loomed large. He clicked. The thread revealed a terse exchange between Sandra and Abigail. "Abigail, I know you told me not to worry, but he didn't come home until 3 a.m. He said it was work again. I'm not an idiot." Sandra's reply was swift. "Don't worry, I've covered for him. Just don't push it right now." Anthony sat back, the implications of the messages swirling in his head. Why would Sandra cover for Luke? What wasn't Abigail supposed to push? The situation felt increasingly murky, and Anthony was determined to uncover the truth. The phone buzzed again with a text from Sandra. "Have you decided? Time is running out." He ignored it, grabbing his keys. Before confronting her, he needed to retrieve the house's deed, insurance, and other vital documents his parents had left in his care. The drive to the house was taut with tension, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Sandra's car wasn't in the driveway. She was likely at one of her long lunches with Abigail. Entering the house, Anthony went straight to his father's study. The filing cabinet in the corner held everything he needed. As he pulled out the documents, a photo on the desk caught his eye, a picture from his wedding day. Sandra and Abigail stood side by side, beaming, with Luke's arm casually draped around Abigail's waist. Yet something in Sandra's posture, leaning subtly toward Luke, gave Anthony pause. Another text from Sandra interrupted his thoughts. "Where are you? We need to talk." Anthony ignored it, packing the documents into his briefcase before locking up. The questions in his mind demanded answers, but he needed more evidence first. Back at the apartment, he spread the papers across the coffee table, piecing together the timeline of his marriage. Each document represented a fragment of a life he had once believed was built on trust. A message from Abigail appeared on his phone. "Sandra's worried. Can we talk?" Anthony snorted bitterly. Of course, Sandra would send Abigail to mediate. His reply was curt. "Not tonight. I need time." The response was immediate. "The house would really help us, Anthony. Luke's been—" Anthony switched off his phone. He wasn't ready to hear the rest. Instead, he reopened the laptop, combing through more emails. Sandra had been meticulous, but small cracks in her facade were beginning to show. One exchange from 6 months ago stood out. "Abigail, we missed you at dinner. Luke said you weren't feeling well." "Thanks for understanding," Abigail had replied. "Didn't want to risk spreading anything." Anthony vividly recalled that evening. Something about it now felt staged. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but he was determined to connect them. Somewhere in the quiet corridors of their shared past, the truth lay hidden, and Anthony was ready to find it. Anthony sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen as his pulse quickened. His suspicions, which had gnawed at him for weeks, were now confirmed. A charge from the Grand Hotel's restaurant leapt out from the list of transactions, dated the very night Sandra had insisted she was too ill to leave home. The pieces were falling into place, forming an unsettling image he could no longer ignore. Her betrayal wasn't confined to their marriage. It implicated her brother-in-law Luke, a man who had once felt like a trusted ally. The thought of them scheming together, while Luke's wife Abigail remained blissfully unaware, was a bitter irony Anthony could scarcely stomach. A knock at the door pulled him abruptly from his thoughts. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole to see Sandra standing there, her expression a blend of frustration and concern. Her office attire hinted at a long day, but Anthony knew better than to trust appearances now. "Anthony, open the door. Your car's parked out front. I know you're in there," she called, her voice steady but edged with irritation. He stepped back, his heart pounding. Facing her now felt premature. He needed time to gather his thoughts and chart his course. "This is ridiculous," she pressed, her tone sharpening. "We need to talk. Stop acting like a child." Her words stung, but Anthony clenched his jaw, remaining silent. Childish? Was it childish to defend the home his parents had entrusted to him, or to question her sudden insistence that he sign it over? Her voice softened, taking on a pleading quality. "Anthony, please. Abigail's counting on us. I wouldn't ask if it weren't important." He leaned his head against the door, struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he'd married with the person now standing outside. How had he missed the signs? Or had he ignored them, hoping for the best? "Fine," Sandra said at last, her voice hardening. "If you want to play this game, so be it. The deadline's still tomorrow." Her footsteps receded, the echo of her heels disappearing down the hallway. Once the building's front door clicked shut, Anthony returned to his desk. Opening a new folder, he began methodically saving emails, receipts, and transactions, every scrap of evidence that connected Sandra's actions to Luke's. His hands trembled as he worked, but his determination held steady. A new email notification caught his eye. A message from Sandra to Abigail. The preview read, "He's not responding. I don't know what else to do if he doesn't sign." The message cut off, but the urgency was clear. Sandra's carefully constructed facade was starting to crack. With a deep breath, Anthony opened another browser tab and searched for divorce attorneys. The act felt surreal, as if someone else were making the decision for him. His wedding ring caught the light, drawing his attention. He twisted it absently, remembering the day she'd slipped it onto his finger with a promise of forever. Slowly, deliberately, he slid it off and placed it on the coffee table next to the house deed. The indentation on his finger felt raw, like an open wound. As the night wore on, Anthony's resolve solidified. Bank statements contradicted Sandra's alibis. Text messages hinted at secrets she hadn't taken care to hide. Near midnight, his phone buzzed with a message from Sandra. "I hope you're using this time to make the right decision, for everyone's sake." Anthony picked up the house deed, his father's bold signature at the bottom anchoring his gaze. He recalled the day his parents had entrusted him with their legacy, their pride in his future with Sandra. "I am making the right decision," he murmured to the empty room, "just not the one you expect." Thunder rolled in the distance as Anthony continued piecing together the puzzle. By morning, he would be ready. The next day began with a flood of messages. "Sandra, time's up. I need your answer." "Abigail, please be reasonable about this." "Sandra, I'm coming by at noon. Have the papers ready." "Abigail, Luke and I are so grateful for your help." The last message clenched Anthony's jaw. Did Abigail have any idea how much Luke had exploited their bond? His laptop was a tangled web of open tabs, emails, bank logs, calendar entries. The timeline left no room for doubt. Each work dinner or late-night meeting matched Luke's schedule too perfectly. His phone rang, Sandra's smiling photo flashing on the screen, a relic of their last anniversary. He answered without speaking. "Anthony," she began brightly, a forced warmth in her tone. "I'm glad you picked up. Maybe I came on too strong yesterday." He stayed silent, letting her falter. "Are you there?" she asked, her confidence slipping. "I'm here," he replied coolly. "Good. Look, I know how much the house means to you. Your parents—" "Don't!" he interrupted sharply. "Don't bring them into this. Anthony, please. Abigail needs—" "When did it start?" His voice was calm but unyielding. She hesitated. "What are you talking about?" "You and Luke," he pressed. "When did it start? Was it 6 months ago? The night you told Abigail you were sick? The night you went to the Grand Hotel instead?" Her silence was damning. "You've been spying on me?" she snapped, anger flaring. "That's disgusting." "Disgusting?" Anthony laughed bitterly. "You're demanding I sign away my family home and I'm the problem?" "This is absurd," Sandra said defensively. "I was at a work dinner." "Enough with the lies," Anthony said, his tone icy. "I have the receipts, the emails, the schedule overlaps. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Her anger evaporated, replaced by a cold calculation. "Sign the papers, Anthony. If you care about this family—" "Family," he interrupted. "Is that what you call sleeping with your sister's husband?" Her voice wavered. "You don't understand." "I understand enough. Just sign the damn papers," she snapped. "We can deal with the rest later." "There won't be a later," he said firmly. "I'm meeting with a lawyer today." "Don't threaten me," she warned, her tone hardening. "You have no proof. Abigail won't believe you." Anthony glanced at the folder on his screen, its contents damning. "We'll see about that." "Noon," Sandra said coldly. "If you don't sign, you'll regret it." The line went dead. Anthony exhaled, setting his phone down. Outside, the city buzzed with the hum of a new day. He stared at the house deed, the embodiment of his parents' trust. By the end of the day, he would ensure their legacy remained intact, no matter the cost. The streets bustled with life, every passerby immersed in their own world, grappling with challenges invisible to those around them. Anthony wondered how many shared a story as fractured as his own. Sitting down with his laptop, he began drafting an email to the lawyer he had recently contacted. Before he could finish, a notification interrupted him. A forwarded message. Sandra to Abigail. He's being unreasonable. Don't worry, Abigail had replied. I'll handle it. Just make sure Luke sticks to our plan. Anthony forwarded the message to his personal email, adding it to the growing collection of evidence. Rising from his seat, he grabbed his keys and headed out, determined to make the most of the few hours before Sandra's arrival. At the bank, he retrieved the security deposit box that contained the original copies of the key documents for the house. His father, ever prudent, had insisted on safeguarding them there, a decision that felt almost prophetic now. As Anthony navigated the congested streets, he reflected on his parents' foresight. Had they sensed something off about Sandra that he had been too blind to see? Under the sterile glow of the bank's fluorescent lights, Anthony carefully removed the documents, placing them securely in his briefcase. These papers, he vowed, would remain beyond Sandra's reach. As he worked, his phone buzzed with a message from Abigail. Sandra says you're making baseless accusations. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He ignored the message, focusing instead on his task. Let them squirm. Let them wonder how much he had uncovered. Their intricate web of lies was unraveling, one thread at a time. Back in his car, Anthony checked the time. 2 hours until Sandra's self-imposed deadline. His phone displayed 5 missed calls, 3 from Sandra, 2 from Abigail. As expected, Luke was conspicuously silent, likely leaving the women to manage the fallout of his missteps. As Anthony left the bank, a new email appeared on his phone, another message from Sandra. This is your last chance. Think carefully before making your next move. Anthony's thoughts turned to his parents, the home they had built with love, and the legacy they had entrusted to him. He considered Sandra's broken promises, the lies she had cloaked in feigned generosity toward her sister. His reply was brief. I am thinking carefully. Are you? At 11:45, Anthony sat in his modest, rented apartment. The coffee table was covered with documents, each one a piece of the puzzle, each a testament to betrayal. The steady ticking of the wall clock marked the minutes as they slipped away. Another message arrived from Abigail. Luke says you're causing unnecessary trouble. Whatever Sandra has done, can't we address this as a family? Anthony's thumb hovered over the reply button. Abigail's trust in her sister's facade was painfully naive. He started typing, only to delete his drafts repeatedly. The truth, he decided, deserved to be delivered in person. A sudden knock shattered the quiet. Sandra had arrived early. Her voice carried through the door, sharp and unyielding. Anthony, open the door. We need to talk. He gathered the documents into his briefcase, leaving only the house deed on the table. When he opened the door, Sandra stood there, impeccably dressed and composed, her makeup masking any trace of guilt. You look terrible, she remarked, stepping inside and immediately noticing the deed on the table. Investigating my wife's infidelity doesn't leave much time for rest, he replied. Her step faltered momentarily before she regained her composure. We don't have time for your baseless accusations, she snapped. These papers need to be signed today. Why the urgency, Sandra? Anthony leaned against the wall, his gaze unwavering. Abigail's financial troubles didn't appear overnight. Stop with the lies. His tone was calm but resolute. I have the emails, the receipts, the evidence of every so-called late-night meeting that never happened. Every moment you spent with Luke left a trail. Fear flashed briefly in her eyes before she masked it with indignation. You're delusional, she said. Luke and I only worked together to support Abigail. Anthony stepped closer. Was that before or after my mother's funeral? Is that why you insisted on taking over family gatherings? To keep Abigail from noticing? Enough, she shouted, her hands clenched into fists. You're twisting everything because you're angry about the house. Anthony's laughter was bitter. The house is what exposed you. You never cared about it before. Suddenly it's your priority? This isn't about Abigail's needs, it's about you and Luke. Sandra's complexion turned ashen. You don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. It's more complicated than you think. No, Anthony said firmly. It's simple. You betrayed Abigail. You betrayed me, and now you're trying to steal my parents' home to cover your tracks." Sandra's expression hardened. "We can fix this," she pleaded. "If you just sign the papers—" "Get out!" Anthony interrupted, opening the door. "Tell Luke I said hello, and tell Abigail. Tell her the truth is coming out soon." Sandra hesitated, her face a mix of fury and desperation. Finally, with a cold glare, she hissed, "You'll regret this." "No, Sandra," Anthony replied, his voice steady. "The only regret I have is not seeing who you truly were sooner." After she left, Anthony collapsed onto the couch. His phone buzzed with more messages from Abigail, but he ignored them. Instead, he opened his email and attached the evidence he had meticulously gathered, sending it to his lawyer. The clock struck noon as he hit send. Somewhere in the city, Sandra was undoubtedly warning Luke that their scheme had crumbled. Abigail, still ensnared in her sister's lies, remained in the dark, but not for much longer. Anthony glanced around his sparse apartment. The emptiness mirrored the void left by a decade of a marriage built on deceit. The house deed, still in his name, rested in his briefcase, a symbol of his parents' legacy preserved. Divorce, confrontations, or exposure of Sandra and Luke's betrayal, whatever lay ahead, Anthony felt ready. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sandra. "This isn't over." For the first time in days, a faint smile crossed Anthony's lips. She was right. It wasn't over. But now, he was prepared for whatever came next. The morning after Sandra's ultimatum, Anthony parked his car across the street from her favorite coffee shop. Through the windshield, he watched as she paced near the entrance, her phone pressed to her ear and her free hand slicing the air in agitated gestures. The tension in her movements was palpable, even from a distance. A buzz from his own phone snapped him out of his thoughts, and Luke's name lit up the screen. It was the first time he'd reached out since everything had come undone. "So you finally decided to call," Anthony greeted, his voice sharp and cold. Luke didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to sort out the situation with the house," he said, trying and failing to sound composed. Anthony let out a mirthless laugh. "The house? That's the first thing you want to talk about? Not the lies, not the betrayal?" "Sandra mentioned you've been making some pretty serious claims," Luke shot back defensively. "Claims? Funny word for facts," Anthony countered, his grip tightening around the phone. "Family doesn't do this to each other, Luke. Or did you forget that?" For a moment, the line was silent. When Luke finally spoke, his voice wavered. "I don't know what you think you've figured out, but it's not what you think." "Sandra hasn't needed to say anything to me," Anthony cut in. "The evidence speaks for itself." "What evidence?" Luke asked, his voice cracking as the bravado slipped away. Anthony's tone turned icy. "Let's clear the air, then. All of us in the same room. You, me, Sandra, and Abigail. Let's see how everything looks when it's out in the open." "That's not necessary," Luke said hurriedly. "We don't need to drag anyone else into this." Anthony's reply was razor sharp. "Like how you handled your business dinner at the Grand Hotel half a year ago? Sandra's credit card was charged the same night, same location. Coincidence?" The silence on the line thickened. Anthony pressed further. "And the emails? The late-night meetings? Shall I go on?" "Stop it," Luke hissed, his voice dropping into a venomous whisper. "You don't understand." "Then explain," Anthony demanded. "Better yet, explain it to Abigail. She deserves to know." "Leave her out of this," Luke pleaded, desperation creeping into his tone. Anthony's eyes stayed locked on Sandra as she hurriedly paced by the cafe door. "That's not an option. You and Sandra made her part of this the moment you started your affair." Luke's voice broke into a whisper. "Just sign the papers. Please, Anthony, for everyone's sake." "Not happening," Anthony replied flatly. "If you want to talk again, bring Abigail. I'm done playing along." He ended the call, watching as Sandra rushed to her car. Almost instantly, his phone lit up with a message from her. "Sandra, what did you say to Luke?" "He's losing it." "Anthony, the truth. You should try it sometime." He barely had a moment to process before another call came through, this time from Abigail. "Anthony, what's going on?" Her voice wavered. "Luke's acting strange and Sandra won't tell me anything. What's happening?" Can we meet? Anthony asked, keeping his tone gentle. Just the two of us? I don't know. Sandra said I shouldn't. Of course she did, he replied calmly. But don't you want to know the truth? A pause stretched before Abigail relented. The cafe on 3rd Street. An hour. Anthony arrived early, choosing a secluded corner table. Abigail walked in 15 minutes later, her expression a mixture of worry and hesitation. Thanks for coming, he said as she sat across from him. She's going to kill me for this, Abigail muttered, twisting her wedding band. She told me not to meet you. Why do you think she'd say that? Anthony asked, studying her carefully. She claims you're just upset about the house and making things up, Abigail said, her uncertainty plain. But she won't explain what. Anthony slid his phone across the table. Look at these, the highlighted dates. Compare them to the nights Luke said he was working late. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the screen. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, heartbreak. This doesn't prove anything, she said weakly. It could mean a lot of things, Anthony admitted quietly, but it doesn't. Keep looking. Her breath hitched as she saw the emails and receipts. Stop, she whispered, her voice cracking. This isn't real, it can't be. Abigail, Anthony said, leaning forward with a firm yet compassionate tone. Why do you think they're so desperate for me to sign over the house? Why the sudden rush? Her face turned pale as understanding dawned. The money, she murmured. They kept saying it was about my financial security, but Luke always told me the business was fine, just a temporary cash crunch. Anthony watched as the realization set in. Her phone buzzed on the table, Sandra's name lighting up the screen. Abigail stared at it as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. You don't have to answer that, Anthony said softly. Abigail let out a bitter laugh. Don't I? She's my sister, my big sister who helped me plan my wedding, who's always had my back. Her voice broke. And now she's been sleeping with my husband. The phone stopped ringing, leaving a heavy silence between them. I should have seen it, she whispered. The late nights, the whispered phone calls, the way they'd act when I walked into the room. This isn't on you, Anthony said firmly. They betrayed you, and me. Abigail wiped her tears, straightening her posture as determination replaced despair. What do we do now? Anthony met her gaze. We make them face the truth. No more lies, no more cover-ups. If they want to talk about the house, we'll talk. All of us. Together. Abigail nodded, her jaw set. When? The choice could no longer be postponed. This was the moment. Abigail gave a small, resolute nod. I'll tell Luke it's urgent, a family emergency. He'll believe it if it comes from you, Anthony replied. Her voice turned sharp, laced with bitterness. Of course he will. To him, I'm just the gullible, trusting wife. Abigail, don't... She cut him off, standing abruptly. Save it for when we're all sitting together. I want to see their faces when everything comes out. Without waiting for a response, she strode out of the room. Moments later, Anthony's phone buzzed with a message from Sandra. Abigail just called Luke. She's setting up a meeting about the house. What did you do? Anthony's lips twisted into a grim smile as he typed back, Not yet, but I will. A heavy tension seemed to settle over Anthony as he pulled into the driveway that evening. 3 cars were already there. Sandra's polished sedan, Luke's luxury SUV, and Abigail's modest compact. Checking his phone, he saw 5 missed calls from Sandra, 3 from Luke, and predictably, none from Abigail. From inside the house, voices carried faintly down the hallway as he stepped through the door. He paused near the entryway, listening intently. This is ridiculous! Sandra's voice rang out, defensive and indignant. He's just trying to turn us against each other. Is that what scares you? Abigail's tone was cold, cutting like a blade. Abigail, darling, Luke began, but she cut him off. Don't you dare darling me. Not now. Anthony entered the living room, his gaze sweeping the space. Sandra and Luke sat at opposite ends of the couch, while Abigail stood rigidly near the fireplace. All 3 turned their attention to him as he stepped inside. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and took a measured breath. Well, he said evenly, It seems the entire family decided to come. Sandra rose quickly. Anthony, let me explain. Sit down. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. To his surprise, she complied. Abigail remained by the fireplace, her posture unyielding, her red-rimmed eyes dry but brimming with fury. Luke kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Anthony's voice cut through the silence. Who wants to start being honest? Sandra's denial came immediately. There's nothing to say. You're blowing this out of proportion. Blowing it out of proportion? Abigail's voice was icy and precise. 6 months ago, the Grand Hotel. Does that ring a bell, Luke? You said you had a work meeting. Luke's complexion turned ghostly pale. Abigail, I can explain. Oh, really? Abigail's attention shifted to Sandra. Or maybe Sandra would like to explain why her credit card has a charge from the same hotel's restaurant that very night. Sandra glared at Anthony. You went through my credit card statements? How could you? Anthony's laugh was low and devoid of humor. How could I? That's rich coming from someone sleeping with her sister's husband. The room descended into a suffocating silence. Luke seemed to sink deeper into the couch, while Sandra's face went sheet white. It's not... Luke started weakly. Not what? Abigail's voice cracked with restrained rage. Not what it looks like? Not what I think? Go on, Luke, lie to me again, just one more time. Abigail, please, Sandra pleaded, rising and extending a hand toward her sister. Abigail recoiled. Don't touch me. How long? Her voice broke as she demanded, How long have you two been deceiving me? Neither Sandra nor Luke answered. The silence screamed louder than words ever could. And the house? Anthony's voice was calm but edged with menace. Care to enlighten us about that brilliant little maneuver? Sandra lifted her head defensively. It wasn't what you think. Abigail needed nothing, Anthony interrupted. This was about covering your tracks. You thought transferring the house to her name would shield you when the truth finally came out. Isn't that right? Abigail's gaze darted to Sandra, disbelief etched on her face. Is that true? Of course not, Sandra stammered, her voice unsteady. We only wanted to help. Stop lying, Abigail's voice cracked. For once, Sandra, just tell the truth. Sandra collapsed back onto the couch, her facade crumbling. You wouldn't understand. Then make us understand, Anthony pressed. Explain why my wife and brother-in-law have been sneaking around. Explain why the house transfer was so urgent. Luke's voice finally broke through. Because we're in love. The confession hung in the air like a toxic fog. Abigail made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Love? She hissed. You call this love? Betraying your wife and your sister? It just happened, Sandra murmured, her voice barely audible. We never planned. Planned? Anthony's voice was biting. The affair? The deceit? The schemes? Looks like you planned plenty. Luke's eyes met Anthony's, defiance flickering briefly. You don't know anything about us. Anthony calmly opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. I know more than enough. Every hotel stay, every late night at work, every lie you spun. It's all here. Sandra's voice rose in alarm. You've been spying on us? No, Anthony replied icily. I've been uncovering the truth you tried so hard to bury. He turned to Abigail. They wanted the house in your name for leverage, financial security for their fresh start. Abigail's eyes darted to Sandra. Were you? She asked, her voice trembling. Were you planning to take everything from me? Sandra's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Abigail covered her mouth with her hand, her composure fracturing. My own sister, my husband, you've been orchestrating this pathetic, cowardly betrayal, Anthony finished. Luke sprang to his feet. You self-righteous bastard! You think you're better than us? Sit down! Anthony's voice was a command. This is my house, my parents' house, the one you tried to steal with your pitiful schemes. Anthony, we can fix this, Sandra pleaded. If we just... There's nothing to fix, Anthony said, his tone final. This family is finished. The facade was finally shattered. What happens now? Luke demanded, his tone razor sharp. You've had your big reveal. What's your next move? Anthony's smile was glacial. What happens now? Now Abigail knows exactly who she married and what kind of sister she has, and I've gathered all the evidence I need for the lawyers. Lawyers? Divorce? Sandra's composure crumbled into stunned disbelief. That's correct, Anthony replied, his voice unyielding. The paperwork is already in motion. You'll be hearing from my attorney soon. He stepped toward the fireplace, standing beside Abigail. Abigail wiped her tears, her voice trembling but resolute. You're not the only one. I'm filing too. Abigail, please. Luke shot halfway out of his seat, desperation etched on his face. Don't come near me, she snapped, her voice shaking but firm. Stay away, both of you. Sandra stood abruptly, her calm veneer completely obliterated. You can't just throw everything away. 10 years of marriage, Anthony. The family we built. Family? Abigail's laugh was sharp and bitter. You destroyed this family the moment you decided to sleep with my husband. Abigail, Luke pleaded, moving toward her. We can fix this. Don't call me that, she retorted, recoiling from him. You lost the right to pretend we're still a couple. I'm still your husband, Luke argued, his voice laden with desperation. Not for much longer, Abigail spat back, her tones searing. She turned her gaze to Sandra, her eyes blazing. And you, my own sister, I trusted you with everything. Sandra's face was streaked with tears as she pleaded. Abigail, it wasn't supposed to be like this. We never meant to hurt you, it just happened. It just happened. Anthony's words were like knives. The same way the house transfer just happened? Or all those secret meetings were mere coincidences? Luke whirled to face Anthony. You think you're so righteous, don't you? Standing there, passing judgment. At least I didn't betray my wife with her sister, Anthony shot back, his voice unshaken. Luke lunged forward, grabbing Anthony by the collar. You sanctimonious! Anthony didn't budge. Go on, Luke. Show everyone exactly the kind of man you are. Stop it, both of you! Abigail's shout froze them. She turned her fiery glare toward Sandra. And you expect me to have a civilized discussion? After everything? Anthony shoved Luke off, his composure unbroken. Civilized? Like scheming to take my family's home was civilized? That's not how it was, Sandra protested, her voice rising. Then explain it, Abigail demanded, her voice steely. Explain how sleeping with my husband and conspiring to steal Anthony's house was anything but selfish. Sandra opened her mouth to respond but faltered, unable to form a defense. The truth, Anthony said, his tone cutting, is they thought they'd never get caught. The house transfer was their escape plan. That's a lie, Luke stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. Then deny it, Anthony challenged, pulling out his phone. Deny the hotel receipts, the emails, the late-night meetings. Look Abigail in the eye and tell her it's all made up. Luke's face turned ashen. He couldn't bring himself to meet Abigail's gaze. Abigail's voice quivered as she spoke. I think it's time I call my lawyer. Wait! Abigail! Sandra reached for her sister. Don't touch me! Abigail recoiled violently, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. Don't you dare touch me again! Anthony stepped between the sisters. I think we're done here. No! Sandra's voice cracked as she pleaded. Anthony, please listen to me. Listen to what? More lies? His voice was frigid. You had 10 years to be honest. You spent them hiding behind deceit. I love him, Sandra blurted out, her words raw and jagged. Abigail's laugh was empty and cutting. Love? You call this love? You destroyed everything, our family, my marriage, Anthony's trust, for what? Luke tried once more. Abigail, please, we can fix— Shut up! Abigail's words silenced him, echoing through the room. No more excuses, not from either of you. Anthony reached into his briefcase and handed Abigail a card. This is my lawyer's contact information. She'll handle the divorce and ensure the house stays protected. Anthony, don't do this, Sandra whispered, her voice breaking. You did this, Anthony replied, his words like ice. Every decision, every lie, this is all on you. Luke tried to interject again. We can fix this. We can work through it. Together. Together? Abigail's voice dripped with scorn. There is no together anymore. You destroyed that. Anthony handed Abigail the card. She'll ensure they can't touch your assets. Sandra's expression hardened, her voice rising. So that's it? You're throwing everything away? Abigail's eyes blazed as she replied. Throwing away what, Sandra? The trust you shattered? The lives you destroyed? You don't understand, Sandra cried, desperation spilling from her voice. I understand perfectly, Abigail snapped. You're cowards who couldn't even admit your betrayal. Luke moved toward her again. Abigail, sweetheart. Her slap silenced him, the sound ringing through the room. We're done, she said quietly, her tone final. All of us. Anthony moved to the door, holding it open. It's time for both of you to leave. Sandra's voice trembled. This is my house, too. Not for much longer, Anthony said coldly. The lawyers will handle the rest. Luke was the first to make a move, striding toward the door with a determined pace and avoiding the eyes of everyone in the room. Sandra lingered, her gaze bouncing between Anthony and Abigail, tears streaking down her face. I never wanted any of this, she whispered. Go, Abigail's voice cracked, but her resolve remained steady. Leave before I say something I'll regret. As the door clicked shut behind them, a suffocating silence enveloped the room. Abigail crumpled onto the couch, trembling uncontrollably. Anthony stood motionless by the window, his eyes fixed on the fading taillights of Luke and Sandra's cars as they vanished into the night. What do we do now? Abigail's voice was barely more than a whisper. Anthony turned to face her, his expression hardened with determination. Now, we fight. For the truth, for justice, and for everything they thought they could take from us. Abigail wiped her cheeks, nodding slowly. Anthony sat beside her, his resolve unshaken. They underestimated us, he said firmly. They thought they could deceive us, drive us apart. They were wrong. Outside, the sky rumbled with the warning of an impending storm. For the first time since Sandra's ultimatum, Anthony felt an unclouded sense of purpose. The lies had unraveled, the truth stood bare. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready. His phone buzzed, displaying a single message from Sandra. This isn't over. Without a second thought, Anthony deleted it. She was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But this time, he would decide what came next. The day of reckoning arrived under a brooding sky, thick with clouds and a biting wind that seemed to carry the weight of the moment. In his late father's study, Anthony methodically laid out every piece of incriminating evidence on the desk. Hotel receipts fanned out like playing cards. Bank statements painted a clear picture of betrayal. Emails detailed the web of lies they had spun. His phone vibrated with a brief message from his lawyer. Settlement papers filed. The judge has expedited the hearing. Last chance to reconsider. Anthony's reply was curt. No turning back. Another message arrived, this time from Abigail. I'm parked down the street as you asked. Sandra's here in a Mercedes. Luke's just pulled up in that flashy sports car. Before Anthony could respond, voices echoed in the foyer. Luke, wait! Sandra's voice was frantic. We need to get our story straight before... Before what? Abigail's voice was sharp and cutting as she stepped forward. Before you spin more lies, dear sister? Sandra's gasp was audible. We never... Clearly. Abigail's heels clicked decisively against the hardwood floor. You didn't think this through, like getting caught, for example. Luke's voice joined in, desperate and pleading. Abigail, please, let me explain. Call me sweetheart one more time, Abigail hissed, her tone venomous, and I'll ensure every one of your clients knows what kind of man you really are. Anthony stepped into the hallway, his presence halting the conversation instantly. Sandra's hand hovered in midair as though frozen. Luke looked as though he wanted to bolt. Abigail stood apart, arms crossed, her expression unforgiving. Living room, Anthony said quietly, though the weight of his words was undeniable. Now. Anthony, please, Sandra's voice wavered. Could we talk in private? Just the two of us? No more private discussions, he replied, gesturing toward the living room. No more secrets, no more lies. Reluctantly, they shuffled into the room, resembling defendants before a judge. Abigail chose the armchair farthest from the others, while Sandra and Luke sat at opposite ends of the couch, carefully avoiding each other's gaze. Sandra smoothed her skirt nervously. "We should approach this rationally," she began. "Rational?" Abigail let out a bitter laugh. "Was sneaking around with my husband rational, or conspiring to steal Anthony's home?" Luke leaned forward, desperation plain on his face. "Abigail, just let me explain." Anthony's voice was icy calm as he opened his briefcase. "Explain how you siphoned company funds for your affair, or how you plan to use Abigail's name to claim this house, or how you thought we'd never find out." Sandra shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know everything," Anthony countered, spreading the evidence across the coffee table. "Every hotel rendezvous, every email about your so-called business dinners, every lie you spun while plotting against us." Sandra lunged for the documents, but Anthony intercepted her, his grip firm but controlled. "Privacy ended when you chose betrayal," he said coldly. "We weren't stealing anything," Luke protested, rising to his feet, fists clenched. "Stealing?" Abigail's voice was sharp. "You mean using me as a pawn to sell this house once it was in my name?" Sandra turned to her sister, her face ashen. "How did you—" "I showed her everything," Anthony said, cutting her off. "Every deleted email, every scheme you thought you'd buried. You underestimated us." Luke collapsed back onto the couch, muttering, "Those emails were supposed to be gone." Anthony's cold smile didn't falter. "Deleting isn't enough when you're dealing with betrayal." Sandra began pacing, her heels tapping out a frantic rhythm. "This is all out of context. You're twisting everything." "Context?" Abigail's voice was razor sharp. "Please, Sandra, explain the context for sleeping with my husband." Sandra's composure cracked. "We didn't mean for this to happen." "You mean you didn't mean to get caught?" Anthony retorted. Tears spilled down Sandra's carefully made-up face. "We never wanted to hurt you. We fell in love." A heavy silence fell. Abigail's expression shifted, cycling through disbelief, anguish, and finally a steely resolve. "Love?" she said, her voice low. "You call destroying marriages, betraying your sister, and scheming against Anthony love?" Luke moved toward her, his hands outstretched. "Abigail, please, don't!" she snapped, backing away. "Do you think I could ever forgive you for looking me in the eye and lying while running to her?" Anthony pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase. "My lawyer has everything," he said evenly. "Proof of the affair, evidence of attempted fraud, misuse of company funds." Luke's face drained of color. "You can't prove—" "Try me," Anthony said, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Really?" Anthony's brow lifted sharply, skepticism etched across his face. "Maybe we should loop in the ethics committee at your company. I'm sure they'd be fascinated to learn about your clever tactic of passing off personal escapades as business expenses." "You wouldn't dare," Sandra hissed, stepping closer to him, her voice barely controlled. "Do you even realize what you're doing to us?" she pleaded, desperation flickering in her tone. "Do you mean like you thought about what you were doing to us?" Abigail's voice cut through the room, sharp and rising with indignation. "Every time you sat across from us at family dinners, scheming behind our backs, every lunch where you acted like you cared about my life while secretly plotting to destroy it." "It wasn't like that." Sandra's voice cracked, her words tinged with despair. "We were going to tell you both. We just needed a little more time." "Time?" Abigail's retort came swiftly, her voice biting. "Time to transfer the house into your name? Time to finalize your escape plan? Time to ensure you got everything you wanted before setting our world on fire?" Luke ran a hand through his hair, visibly frazzled. "You're making it sound like this was all some calculated scheme." "Wasn't it?" Abigail shot back, her glare cutting through him. Anthony, unfazed, pulled out a neat stack of documents. "Let's discuss the secret account you opened 3 months ago, Sandra. The one you've been quietly funneling money into. Preparing for this moment, weren't you?" Sandra's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "How did you—" "I found it all," Anthony replied icily. "The offshore account, the meetings with divorce attorneys, the property listings you've been poring over together." Luke's face paled as he tried to muster indignation. You've been spying on us? Spying? Anthony's laugh was cold and humorless. Call it protecting what's mine. Did you really think I wouldn't notice your sudden interest in my family's house? Abigail stepped closer to Anthony, standing firmly by his side. Tell me, Sandra, she said, her voice low but dripping with venom. When did you decide to stop being my sister and start trying to replace me? That's not fair. Sandra clenched her fists, her voice shaking. You don't understand the pressure we've been under. Pressure? Abigail's voice rose, brimming with anger. Try sitting at a holiday dinner with your lying husband and scheming sister, pretending everything's fine. Try faking smiles while they conspire behind your back. That's pressure. Luke stepped forward, palms out in a placating gesture. Abigail, if you just listen. Listen to what? She interrupted, her tone sharp. More lies? More excuses? Here, let me jog your memory. She grabbed her phone and began scrolling. 2 weeks ago, you told me you had a late meeting, but you were at the Grand Hotel with Sandra. Last month, a business trip that was anything but. You kept those messages? Sandra whispered, her voice faint. Of course she did, Anthony replied coldly. Just as I've kept every email, every receipt, every shred of evidence that exposes you both. He pulled out another sheet of paper, its imposing legal letterhead stark against the tension in the room. Here's how this ends. You both sign this settlement agreement. Uncontested divorces. No claims to the house or assets. You walk away and leave us for good. Luke's voice wavered as he tried to sound defiant. And if we refuse? Anthony's expression hardened. Then I send everything. To your firm, Luke. Every forged report, every misused resource, every client meeting that was just an excuse for your affair. Sandra instinctively moved closer to Luke, their solidarity finally apparent. We could fight this, she said, trying to rally. Together we could… Do what? Abigail cut in, her disdain slicing through the air. Lie some more? Manipulate us further? Find new ways to use me as a pawn in your twisted plans? You don't get it, Sandra pleaded, her voice cracking. We didn't mean for any of this to happen. We couldn't control how we felt. Anthony's tone turned frigid. Couldn't control it? Like you couldn't control trying to steal my family's home? Or deceiving us at every turn? Or trampling over the very values you once claimed to stand for? Luke glanced down at the settlement papers, his shoulders slumping. What does it say exactly? It's straightforward, Anthony replied, his tone clinical. You admit to the affair. You agree to uncontested divorces. You waive any claim to the house and shared assets, and you stay out of our lives forever. Sandra straightened, trying to muster defiance. And if we don't sign? Abigail's icy smile was sharp enough to cut. Then every single document becomes public. Every email, every receipt, every lie. What do you think your firm will say, Luke? Or your friends, Sandra? Sandra's voice quivered. You wouldn't. Try me, Anthony said, placing 2 pens on the table. The choice is yours. Sign and leave with a shred of dignity, or fight and lose everything. Luke's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. She's right, he said quietly. It's over. Luke, no. Sandra grabbed his arm, her voice filled with panic. We can't just walk away from everything we… Everything we what? Luke shook her off, his voice hollow. Everything we stole? Everything we lied about? Look around, Sandra. This is the end. Anthony's gaze was unyielding. Sign it, both of you, then leave. Luke signed first, the sound of the pen scratching against the paper cutting through the silence. He avoided Abigail's gaze as he stepped back. Sandra hesitated, tears streaming down her face. Anthony, please. 10 years of marriage has to mean something. It ended, Anthony said, his voice void of emotion, the moment you chose him over your vows. Her signature was shaky, but final. The sound of the pen hitting the table felt like a hammer striking a nail. It was over. Luke's voice was subdued. What now? Now, Abigail said with icy finality, you leave, both of you, and you hope we never have to release those documents. Sandra reached out to her sister, desperation painted across her face. Abigail, please, we're still family. Abigail's bitter laugh filled the room. Family? Let me explain something to you. Family doesn't sleep with your husband. Family doesn't try to steal your home. Family doesn't destroy your life while smiling to your face. It wasn't about destroying you, Sandra protested. We were going to make it right. Make it right? Anthony's voice was scathing. By convincing Abigail to sell the house after it was in her name, using her share to fund your new life together? Luke's head jerked up. How did you... Anthony handed another email printout to Abigail. This one, the one where you discussed it in detail. Once it's in Abigail's name, we can convince her to sell. The market's strong, and with her share plus our savings. Abigail's hands trembled as she read, her face reddening with fury. You were going to use my share to bankroll your future and leave me with nothing? Sandra tried to reach her again. Abigail, it wasn't enough! Abigail's voice thundered. Get out, both of you, now! Sandra and Luke hesitated, but Anthony's steely glare left no room for argument. Slowly they turned and left, their steps heavy with defeat. As the door closed, Abigail exhaled a shaky breath, her anger still simmering but mingled with a deep sense of relief. The lies were exposed, the betrayals severed. At last, only silence remained. Abigail recoiled sharply as if burned. Don't touch me! Don't ever touch me again! She hissed, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And don't bother speaking to me either. Anthony stepped toward the front door, pulling it open with a firm motion. Both of you, leave now. This house is still mine too, Sandra said weakly, her voice trembling with desperation. Not anymore, Anthony replied coldly, holding up the settlement papers like a final verdict. You signed it all away, or have you forgotten? Luke slumped his shoulders, his posture resigned as he made his way to the door. Just as he reached the threshold, he paused and glanced back. Abigail, whether you believe it or not, I did love you. Her expression remained icy, her tone even colder. Save it for someone naive enough to believe you. Sandra lingered at the doorway, her gaze wandering over the house, a home that once held a decade's worth of memories. Anthony, she started, her voice barely above a whisper, a final plea hanging in the air. It's done, he said with steely finality. You made your choice the moment you put him above our marriage. As the door closed behind them, the house descended into an oppressive silence. Abigail sank into the couch, her earlier anger dissipating to reveal the raw pain beneath. I keep thinking I'll wake up, she said softly, her voice barely audible, that this nightmare will just disappear. Anthony's phone vibrated, a message from his lawyer lighting up the screen. The documents are being filed as we speak. The judge wants to see us tomorrow morning, he said, holding the phone for her to see. This is real. Abigail nodded slowly, her expression hardening. Good. The sooner it's over, the better. I want them out of our lives for good. Another buzz interrupted their conversation, this time from Luke's legal team. Anthony's lips curved into a grim smile as he read the message. What now? Abigail asked, her voice laced with weary suspicion. The ethics board just received an anonymous tip about Luke's expense reports. They're opening an investigation. Abigail let out a bitter laugh, devoid of any humor. Couldn't happen to a more deserving person. The doorbell rang suddenly, and through the window they saw Sandra standing on the porch, with Luke hovering by his car at the end of the driveway. This isn't over! Sandra shouted, her voice breaking with emotion. You can't end it like this! Abigail's expression turned to stone as she glanced at Anthony. Can we call the police? Have them removed? Anthony was already dialing. Yes, officers. I need assistance. 2 individuals are refusing to leave my property after being served legal documents. 20 minutes later, they watched from the window as a police cruiser escorted Sandra and Luke off the premises. Sandra's tear-streaked face twisted with anguish, while Luke's pallor suggested he might collapse under the weight of humiliation. Do you think they understand now? Abigail asked quietly. If not now, they will soon, Anthony replied, his tone resolute. His phone buzzed again with a message from his lawyer. The judge is taking this very seriously. It seems the property fraud issue caught his attention. Abigail's phone chimed next. She groaned as she glanced at the screen. Sandra must have called Mom. What does she want? Anthony asked. Reading the text, Abigail's expression darkened. She wants us to sit down and resolve things as a family. Abigail quickly typed a reply and tossed her phone aside. I told her there's no family anymore. Sandra and Luke destroyed that. Anthony sat beside her, his gaze drifting to the family photos that adorned the walls, soon to be packed away. We'll need to change the locks, he said matter-of-factly. Upgrade the security system. Let the neighbors know. Already in motion. Abigail held up a business card. The locksmith comes tomorrow. I've also drafted an email to cancel Sandra and Luke's guest passes for the community pool. Despite everything, Anthony managed a small smile. You've always been thorough. I learned from the best, she replied, gesturing toward his meticulously organized evidence files. What happens to all that, by the way? We keep it, Anthony said firmly. Insurance, just in case they try something else. His phone buzzed again with a message from Sandra. You'll regret this. One day you'll understand what love really is. Without finishing, Anthony deleted the message and blocked her number. Beside him, Abigail did the same to Luke's contact information. No more chances, she said quietly. No more lies, he agreed. The judge's chambers were smaller than Anthony had anticipated, the confined space intensifying the tension. Sandra and Luke sat across the room with their lawyers, their expressions a mix of defiance and resignation. Anthony and Abigail were flanked by their own legal team, armed with thick folders of evidence. Judge Harrison flipped through the documents, his gaze sharp as he addressed the room. You're alleging attempted property fraud, misappropriation of funds, and conspiracy? Anthony's lawyer nodded, sliding a stack of documents forward. Yes, Your Honor. We have extensive evidence to support these claims. Sandra's lawyer tried to intervene. Your Honor, my client's actions were motivated by, she was trying to protect her family. Luke's lawyer chimed in quickly. Protect? Abigail's voice rang out, sharp and incredulous. Is that what we're calling it now? The judge raised a hand to restore order. Mrs. Walker, please keep your composure. Luke's lawyer fumbled with his papers as Anthony's lawyer interjected. Your Honor, we've also provided copies of the preliminary findings from Mr. Walker's Ethics Board investigation. Luke sank lower in his chair, his confidence thoroughly deflated. Sandra instinctively reached for his hand but froze, her hesitance betraying her inner conflict. The judge closed the folder in front of him. The settlement terms are straightforward and generous under the circumstances. Sandra's lawyer leaned forward. My client wishes to contest certain provisions. No, Sandra interrupted, her voice steady for the first time. No more fighting. We accept. Luke hesitated before nodding. Let's just end this. Judge Harrison surveyed the room. Given the evidence and the defendant's agreement, the settlement is approved as written. Restraining orders will be finalized by the end of the day. As they exited the chambers, Sandra made one last attempt to approach Abigail. Please, just 5 minutes. Abigail's icy glare stopped her mid-step. Don't come any closer. The restraining order isn't active yet, but I'll call security without hesitation. Luke grabbed Sandra's arm, steering her away. It's over, he said, his voice hollow. Abigail and Anthony watched their former spouses walk away, their figures burdened by the weight of their choices. Well, Abigail said quietly, that's that. Anthony glanced at his phone, noting 3 missed calls from their mother. Wonderful, he muttered, the word dripping with sarcasm. Susan, Sandra's most trusted confidant, was overflowing with opinions, while Anthony sat silent, his shoulders heavy with a sigh. So much for a calm start to the day, he murmured. The two had taken refuge in a quiet cafe across from the courthouse, seeking solace from the storm swirling around them. They settled in a corner booth, their untouched coffee cooling on the table. Mom's taking Sandra's side, Abigail announced, her fingers flicking through her messages. Frustration laced her tone. She thinks we're being cruel, unwilling to forgive. Anthony's voice sharpened. Of course she does. Sandra's always been a master of playing the victim. A man in a sharp suit interrupted their conversation, approaching with measured politeness. Mr. Thompson, I'm Richard Morton, representing the ethics board at Luke's firm, and you must be Abigail Stratton. May I sit? Abigail gestured to the empty chair. Go ahead. What's this about? Morton placed a crisp business card on the table. We've completed our preliminary review. Both of you will need to provide formal statements. You'll have them today, Anthony replied, his tone firm. Once Morton departed, Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her cup. Are you all right? Anthony asked, concern softening his voice. Not really, she admitted. But I'll get there. Luke made his choices. Now he has to deal with the fallout. Anthony's phone buzzed, drawing his attention. It was a text from his neighbor, Tom. Sandra's here trying to break into the house. Should I call the police like you said? He showed Abigail the message. They just don't know how to quit. Let's go handle it, Abigail said, rising from her seat. When they arrived, 2 police cars were already stationed outside. Sandra sat in the back of one, her mascara streaking her tear-stained face. Officer Chin approached them, clipboard in hand. She claims this is her residence and accuses you of locking her out illegally. Anthony handed over a stack of court documents. As of this morning, she has no legal claim to the property and is barred from coming near it. The officers escorted Sandra to a waiting patrol car, her pale, distraught face visible through the window. Think she'll understand now? Abigail asked. Anthony's expression was steely. If not, a night in jail for violating the restraining order should make it clear. Inside, Anthony began boxing up the last remnants of Sandra's belongings. Abigail glanced at her phone. The locksmith will be here in an hour. A security company's coming tomorrow to install cameras. Anthony held up a framed wedding photo. What should we do with these? Burn them? Abigail suggested with a half-smile. Anthony smirked faintly. Tempting. Let's store them for now. The lawyers can decide. As they worked, Abigail remarked, You know this isn't the end. Sandra doesn't accept defeat easily. Anthony's resolve was firm. Let her try. We have the truth and the evidence to prove it. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Luke's firm. Ethics board hearing scheduled for Monday. Your presence is required. Ready to see his career collapse? Anthony asked, showing Abigail the message. She straightened. It's time to tell the truth. After that, it's up to him to face the consequences. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, but the atmosphere in the law firm's conference room was anything but. The room was packed with senior partners, all staring at Luke as he fumbled to justify years of falsified expense reports. They were just client dinners, he stammered. Routine meetings with my sister-in-law. Richard Morton raised a thick stack of receipts. At the Grand Hotel? Over weekends? He asked pointedly. Abigail sat in the front row, her presence a silent condemnation. Anthony sat beside her, his expression unwavering as Luke's facade unraveled. Morton addressed the room coldly. The board has reviewed all evidence, including statements from Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Walker regarding the property fraud scheme. Luke's face turned ashen. That was a private family matter, he protested weakly. Using firm resources makes it our matter, a senior partner snapped. Hotel charges on client accounts, falsified reports, embezzlement. Luke's voice was desperate. I can explain. Morton cut him off. Save it. The board has decided. Your termination is effective immediately. This matter will also be referred to the Bar Association. Luke staggered, visibly shaken. You can't do this. My career. Abigail's voice was steady but resolute. You should have thought about that before using client accounts to fund your affair. Luke turned to her, pleading. Abigail, please, don't do this. Morton signaled security. Escort him out. His personal items will be delivered to his home. As Luke was led away, whispers rippled through the partners. Words like shameful and unbelievable filled the air. Outside, Sandra stood by her car, her expression venomous. Are you satisfied? She hissed. You've ruined him. Abigail's response was calm but unyielding. He ruined himself, and you helped. We could have handled this privately, Sandra snapped. As a family. Anthony's laugh was cold. Family? You lost the right to that word the moment you betrayed us. Sandra stepped closer, her anger flaring. You self-righteous, Anthony interrupted. Back off. Remember the restraining order. Sandra froze, tears brimming. "I've lost everything. My sister, my marriage, my reputation." Abigail's voice was sharp. "And your chance to steal Anthony's home." Sandra's tone turned defensive. "It wasn't stealing. We just wanted—" Anthony's voice was like steel. "We know exactly what you wanted. The emails spell it all out." Sandra's glare hardened. "This isn't over." Abigail held up her phone. "It is unless you want these documents made public. I'm sure your friends would love the details." They watched Sandra storm off, her car's tires screeching as she sped away. "She'll be back," Abigail murmured. "Let her," Anthony replied, glancing at his watch. "Ready for the next battle?" The Bar Association hearing was swift and damning. Luke sat alone as the committee laid out the charges: embezzlement, property fraud, and misuse of funds. Their decision was immediate. His law license was suspended, pending further investigation. This time, Luke didn't argue. He slumped in his chair, silent as his career disintegrated. Outside, he made one last attempt. "Abigail," he called, "was it worth it? Destroying everything we built?" She turned to face him, her voice unwavering. "You destroyed it. The moment you chose my sister over our marriage, the moment you tried to steal Anthony's home. This," she gestured at the building, "is just the aftermath." Back at the house, Anthony and Abigail sat in the newly secured living room. The locks were changed, cameras installed, and Sandra and Luke's belongings packed away. Abigail sighed. "Mom called again. She still doesn't get it." Anthony placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She will in time. For now, we move forward." Abigail glanced at her phone with a look of disapproval. "She claims we're being petty." "No," Anthony replied with measured calm. "We're being honest. There's a significant distinction." His phone buzzed with another message, this time from Sandra. "You've destroyed everything for us. Hope you're satisfied with your so-called justice," the text read. Anthony showed the screen to Abigail before blocking the number without hesitation. "Justice?" Abigail repeated with a bitter laugh. "They still don't understand. This isn't about getting even." Anthony's voice remained steady. "They never thought we'd stand up for ourselves. That's where they miscalculated." "One of many mistakes," Abigail murmured as she moved toward the window. "The worst part is how they still paint themselves as victims. They can't even acknowledge what they've done." "That's typical of people like them," Anthony said, joining her by the window. "It's easier for them to deflect than to face their own guilt." A month passed. Anthony stood in his father's study, observing the images displayed on the newly installed security monitors. The screens showed quiet, undisturbed rooms, a neatly kept garden, and a driveway free of unwelcome visitors. Finally, some peace, he thought, though the shadow of its cost still loomed. His phone vibrated with a text from Abigail. "Sandra tried to enter my office today. Security escorted her out. She was crying about family and forgiveness." "Should I contact the police?" he texted back. "Already taken care of. She got a warning. Any further incidents, and she'll be facing charges." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Checking the feed, he saw Susan, Sandra's former best friend, standing on the porch with an envelope clutched in her hands. When he opened the door, Susan spoke nervously. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but—" She hesitated, then thrust the envelope toward him. "Sandra begged me to give this to you. She said it would explain everything. She made me promise you'd read it." Anthony took the envelope but didn't open it. "And what about you? Do you still stand by her?" Susan looked away. "I saw the evidence, the emails, the receipts. Abigail showed me. I can't believe Sandra would do that to her own sister." "Believe it," Anthony said flatly, slipping the envelope into his pocket. "Is that all?" Susan lingered. "Luke, he's lost his license for good. The Bar Association ruled against him, and the firm is suing him for the money he embezzled." "Every action has consequences," Anthony said simply. After Susan left, he called Abigail. She arrived 20 minutes later and found him seated with the unopened envelope in his hands. "Should we read it?" he asked. Weighing the envelope thoughtfully, Abigail responded, "More excuses? More attempts to twist the truth? Another bid for sympathy?" "Probably." Without further discussion, she carried the envelope to the fireplace, struck a match, and set it alight. Together they watched as Sandra's words turned to ash. "That's my answer," Abigail said quietly. Anthony's phone buzzed again, displaying their mother's number. He declined the call without hesitation. "She'll have to come to terms with it eventually," Abigail said, exhaling deeply. "We're not going to forgive and forget just to save face." "Some wounds are too deep," Anthony agreed. "Some things can't be repaired." Another ring of the doorbell broke the silence. This time it was Tom, their neighbor from next door. "Just thought you should know," Tom began hesitantly. "I saw Luke parked down the street earlier watching your house. I called the cops like you asked me to." "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it," Anthony said, making a mental note to properly thank his neighbor later. It was a reassuring reminder that trustworthy people still existed, even in a world where loyalty was hard-won. As the evening wore on and shadows deepened, Abigail helped Anthony hang new family photographs. For the first time, there were no pictures of Sandra or Luke, only images of those who had remained loyal and true. "You know what I've realized?" Abigail said, adjusting a frame. "They believed we'd fall apart, that we'd accept their lies and let them come out on top." "Their gravest mistake," Anthony said, stepping back to admire the arrangement. "They underestimated our commitment to the truth." His phone buzzed again, another message from Sandra sent using a different number. "I'll never stop trying to make you understand. What Luke and I have is real." Without reading further, Anthony deleted the message and blocked the number. Abigail did the same when she received a similar message from Luke. "No more chances," she said firmly. "No more deceit," he agreed. As the night enveloped their home, they sat together in silence, reflecting on the storm they had endured. Though they bore the scars of betrayal, they had emerged stronger. The truth had come to light, and with it, a newfound sense of liberation. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, marking the end of fractured trust and broken promises. Tomorrow promised a fresh start, one they would face with resilience and clarity. In the house their parents had built, surrounded by reminders of integrity and loyalty, Anthony felt a renewed purpose. Some battles had to be fought. Some truths needed to be revealed, no matter the cost, and some betrayals could never be forgotten. Outside, the hum of a car engine broke the quiet, likely Luke or Sandra making one last pass at what they'd lost. Inside, however, the house remained a sanctuary. Anthony and Abigail sat together, fortified by the bonds that endured and the truths they refused to compromise. Despite all they had lost, they had held on to their self-respect, their principles, and most importantly, the truth. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.